Okay, welcome, fellow Earthlings. And this is A Raging Atheist. I'm your host for tonight, John Petersen. And tonight we are going to have a discussion about virtue ethics and the golden mean, which we also go into discussion of the tolerance paradox. As you can see on the screen there, Nokasuchi is with us tonight. He had the night off, so he is here to take part in the discussion. We also have Socka Count and Kai, another bot on this channel, and she is quite well versed on virtue ethics. So I'm glad to have her, albeit for not the entire stream. And I'll let her tell you why she's going to have to cut out early now. How are you doing, Kai?
I'm doing all right. I'm recovering. I had a bit of a rough night, so but apologies to the chat and for my accent, because I know some people it bothers them. So
well, I say to hell with those people it bothers.
Actually, in about an hour over on Sticks and Stonehenge, we're going to be doing a live stream on the Kurds. We're going to be talking about the way they organize their society and what's been going on with this conflict, and why it would be such a loss for the four countries that would be impacted if Syria and Iran get what they want.
Awesome. That sounds awesome. I'll have to catch that later on. And actually, after outing myself last night, I'll have to catch that as my first episode of Sticks and Stonehenge, because I stuck my foot in my mouth last night and outed myself as not having caught an episode yet. And we're also joined by Socka Count. Welcome, Socka.
Hey, hi. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to a fun discussion.
I see we have the 007 sock in the house tonight. And we are also joined by this channel's owner and my brother from another mother, Nokasuchi. How you doing tonight, Nok?
Pretty good, man. Pretty good. I'm ready for this conversation. It's going to be a good one. And that's not just any James Bond Socka. That's GoldenEye Socka, John.
Oh, okay. All right. That was a great PlayStation game. That was a great PlayStation game, by the way.
N64.
Yeah.
Yep, it was the game that came with the N64 if you bought it far enough after its release.
All right, we're gonna jump into this. I just want to mention that next week I'm flipping the script a little bit here. Next week on Wednesday night, I'm going to be on the Great Debate Community. And on Saturday night, I'm going to be on Knox channel. So I'm just flipping the days around. And next Wednesday, I'm going to be on the Great Debate Community with the night before Halloween with Misha and Jerry Griffith. And we're going to have a discussion about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So it should be spooktacular. There's my bad pun for the night. And before we get going, I just want to say thanks, Zacto. See you in the chat. Rational Canadian Atheist. Callan's here. Tony Designs, one of the best advertisers of this channel.
Tony is a Discord wizard.
Yeah, and Kent Hoven CPA is here. Thank you for coming by. Dino Botful. I don't know. I probably said that wrong. Be mindful. And so I think Socka was talking to us before we started about how he kind of saw the framework of this discussion going. So I want to throw it over to Socka for a couple minutes and then let Allie jump in, because like I said, we have Allie for a limited time, so Socka, if you could just take a few moments and frame the beginning of the conversation where you would like it to go, and then toss it to Allie, because she's very learned on this topic and we don't have her for very long. So take it away, Socka.
Awesome. So this is a fun topic, and a lot of them, and it also kind of maps out the crazy train of ideas that goes through my head here. Is that John had a stream the other day with Faye the Most Gracious, Topic Thunder, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the last woman's name.
Saf.
Saf. And I presented a question to them at the end of them, which was essentially the paradox of tolerance, which is a really interesting topic. And from there, me and John had kind of a discussion about, the paradox in relation to, whether or not, tolerance was a virtue or a vice. And, to get into that conversation, you have to go into virtue ethics. And to go into virtue ethics, you got to kind of understand, normative ethics. And so it was just like this working back to this point here, and I thought that, this would be a great idea for, the John kind of learn shit show. So we're going to just start walking it back the other way. Hopefully we can finish off back on to the tolerance, or the paradox of tolerance. But to start off with, just the kind of the basic ethical viewpoint here. And I'm not going to do a deep dive into these things, but one of the things I want to point out is that with a lot of these conversations, there is that we have, especially with theists, and this is kind of why it's appropriate, like on the Raging Atheist channel, is that we see the conversation about morality and ethics come up often, but it's always phrased in this like, is morality subjective? Is morality objective? And people can find themselves getting, kind of shoehorned into certain positions. Everybody's heard William Lane Craig's argument that if objective morals exist, God exists. Objective morals exist, therefore, right, God exists. And a lot of atheists will, or people that necessarily aren't religious, will find themselves defaulting to positions of ethical subjectivism or moral anti-realism. And it's kind of wrong, because it kind of like guides the conversation in this direction, kind of puts people, in these positions they might not hold to, without kind of fully kind of like looking into them.
Can I interrupt briefly?
Absolutely.
I feel like that whole discussion really isn't even about objective versus subjective morality. It's really like Christians trying to frame that debate around divine command theory, ultimately.
Absolutely.
Because that's what makes it so boring to me, because I'm not a divine command theorist, despite being a theist.
Yeah, and it is weird. It is a kind of a and it's the point is it's a distortion of the actual conversation, and that the topic of whether or not morality is objective or subjective is really actually not that interesting of a topic. But there are so many more kind of interesting things we can dive into, and that's what we're going to try to get into with this. First off, is that first.
Oh, you've got quite the little ragamuffins running around in the background, don't you?
Yeah, my apologies. My kids are here, but so within the conversation, we're going to be focusing on an aspect of the conversation of ethics that doesn't really get a lot of traction within kind of like the layman understanding of like these philosophical discussions. We're not going to be talking about moral objectivism or moral subjectivism, moral realism, moral anti-realism, what do you want to call it. Those are meta-ethical views, and meta-ethics is interesting. It covers things like what do these words mean? Like, what does it mean? When we talk about good or evil or bad, what is it that we're actually talking about with these words?
To be fair, when you're talking about Aristotelian ethics, which is what we've sort of discussed wanting to talk about, he spends the entire first couple of chapters of the first book talking about what the hell does good even mean. You kind of do have to establish that when you start talking about virtue.
Yeah. And so with that, great point. But the one thing that virtue ethics kind of gets into is that, that you can either start at the framework of the metaethical viewpoint. And like I was saying, that like I alluded to there, is that virtue ethics deals with the metaethical aspects of it, but then also there's like this really smooth transition into the normative ethics of it. And the normative ethics is where virtue ethics really shines, because up against comparable normative ethical theories like consequentialism or deontology. virtue ethics is really unique in the way that it approaches questions about how one ought to act in these moral situations. So while you have these other systems that work on this kind of like top-down kind of example, like where you start off with like some of the consequentialism, and then you evaluate.
They're very external. They're very
Yeah.
external in their motivation, whereas virtue ethics is significantly more focused on the character of the individual.
Right. So consequentialism or deontology will deal with like the actions themselves, and whether someone is good or bad will be dictated by those actions themselves. Well, virtue ethics starts with the person. You start with somebody who is good, that is virtuous, and from there, right actions will follow from that. So it's a really kind of like bottom up type approach compared to the top down of other normative theories. And into that, we get into essentially that's like the brief introduction, as brief as I can make a discussion about the difference between metaethics and normative ethics. That's about as brief as I can get. And I'll throw it over to Alakai to get into virtue ethics, I guess.
Well, the first thing that we kind of need to start with, if we're talking specifically about Aristotle's sort of, I would call it his magnum opus, Nicomachean Ethics. It is quite the dense read for folks who aren't as familiar with philosophy. I tortured myself with it as my first foray into philosophy because I'm an idiot that hates myself. But effectively, what he defines it as is the balance between deficiency and excess for a given trait. So the sort of epitome example that he often gives is courage being a virtue is in between recklessness on one end of excess and cowardice on the end of deficiency. And so, like, in this way, it tends to be individual, what right action is, and it also tends to be situational, meaning that it has to do more with who you are and what you're dealing with, what is correct or right or virtuous in any given situation. And it is also something, character and virtue is something that is built up over time through practice. Aristotle was quite insistent that one learns to be virtuous rather than one being inherently virtuous one way or the other, though he did have some very interesting ideas about heritability and upbringing.
Can I just, I want to just interject something real quick here. So from my limited understanding, what little research I did ahead of time, the golden, when you talk about the golden mean, any golden mean between two vices of excess and deficiency, it's not only going to be different for every person, it's also going to be different for like every situation. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what I just said. I said it's situational and personal. So what looks like courage to you, say sitting here trying, like, let's say you're sitting here trying to confess your feelings to someone or something, right? What looks like courage to you in that situation is very different than what looks like courage to, say, a soldier on the battlefield. And what's reckless and what's cowardice would be very different for both of those situations, but it's still the same virtue you're talking about.
Doc, you have anything at this point?
Yeah, well, I find this fascinating as I was researching it today. And by my understanding, this isn't like a law. This is just basically, it explains why people act virtuous. And from what I understood of it, virtuous people naturally kind of see the golden mean and gravitate towards that line of behavior to where it's not really a law like you can apply to, say, murder. There's going to be no virtuous murder. There's going to be no golden mean, so to speak, when it comes to things like that. And Aristotle spoke on it.
Aristotle didn't quite seem to think people naturally gravitated towards it, though he did believe that vice was a product of a lack of knowledge rather than a deficiency of, like, inherent to the person.
Yeah, and if I could add one more point to that as well, is that like Alakai was saying before, like this learned behavior. It's just that essentially through your experience and observations that you see which behaviors are rewarding. You see how people act. And the idea, when I'm sure Alakai can go into this more, is that people recognize the state of eudaimonia, if I'm pronouncing that right.
Eudaimonia.
Yeah, thank you very much. and because you recognize that, like, is that you see that acting in such a way will bring this on. And the idea of virtue ethics is not to assert this on other people, but just by essentially being this beacon of virtue is enough to convince the people around you that they also should be acting in this way because they recognize the state as well.
Yeah, Aristotle was a big believer that you develop most of your virtuous behaviors in childhood, right?
Yes, he was quite concerned with one's upbringing. He talks a lot about how one who is... He used the comparison of a sow at one point. He basically, one who's brought up among pigs behaves as one who is brought up among, like those who are, royalty will behave as one. But recent psychology, although it has justified a number of his beliefs in the larger sense, like you do pick up a lot from childhood, what we understand about neuroplasticity shows that ethical development is more of a lifelong thing. You can still, it's a lot harder to change your brain at 50 than it is at 20, but you still can do it.
Yeah. It's a great reference I saw today was in regards to smoking. There's really no golden mean to it, but like a person that doesn't smoke, their habit is, they're not going to smoke. So for a person like me that has smoked pretty much my entire life, it's much harder for me to do that virtuous thing, which would be the healthy thing and not smoke, to where for a non-smoker, it's not even really a thought. It was fascinating. Some of the things that I saw today.
I saw that one too in one of the videos I watched. They brought up that smoking analogy.
Yeah, the quote I was earlier. Sorry to cut you off, Alec. The quote that I was trying to find. Aristotle said, "Some things are wrong, no matter how little or how much you have of them." So I think from my research, he was really clear that the golden mean is not like a law, but just pretty much a way to explain people's ability to be virtuous. And then after you make your point, or other people get involved, I do have another point that I would like to relate to Christians before we move on from the golden mean.
Well, I just wanted to refute something quickly that you were talking about with habits, because you're correct. It's going to be very difficult for you to not smoke, but what might be a lot easier is to replace the smoking habit with something else. That's why a lot of ex-smokers develop an oral fixation, like they start chewing gum or things of that nature, because the impulse that you've developed from that particular neural pathway is something goes in mouth when stressed out, Like, it's one of the reasons why for a little while, vaping and stuff, people had some more success with that, though there's some level of research that's showing that may be changing, that people may not be getting off of nicotine, they end up going back to cigarettes. But yeah, it's interesting how much more of addiction is actually behavioral rather than actually physical.
Yeah, I had actually quit for 3 months vaping, and then I smoked 1 or 2 cigarettes, and boom, I was right back to smoking cigarettes. But yeah, that's off topic. I just a little pointer there about what you said.
So, Socka, if you'd like to jump in on any of this commentary, because I think we're pretty close to being able to get to a segue talking about tolerance and intolerance in relation to the golden mean.
Well, I think maybe, just on the topic of the golden mean, it is an interesting kind of idea. One of the ideas when we're kind of analyzing these virtues is that, they come about as, this is where I would, I'm kind of like on the fence about is that do we discover virtues by knowing the vices, or is it only through recognizing a vice do we seek the virtue? And because there's certain things that get labeled into these categories that where does the golden mean truly make sense, or is there certain things that are out there that we can recognize the vices, but we're absent understanding what this golden mean is, whether we don't have a word to describe it, or the way that we do talk about it is just isn't good. Here's a good example.
Well, I mean, Aristotle does outright say that there are a number of things that don't have virtues attached to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the fun ones is when it comes to believing claims. So you have 2 vices that we can associate with that. But the first one is if somebody was to tell you something So there's some type of measure of belief. You to believe everything unquestionably, would lead you to
Gullibility.
Gullibility. You'd be, no critical thinking abilities whatsoever. You're not really analyzing stuff. But then what's the opposite of gullibility?
Extreme skepticism, doubting one's own existence.
Extreme skepticism, right. Now, so when we talk about the golden mean in this one, is that one of the ideas to get put forward with this one is that there is a certain trust that is formed there. Like that, the actual golden mean between these positions is a position of trust. Okay, yeah, one second, buddy. But then, I'm not sure if trusting a belief, just trust on its own is a virtue. I mean, I would say that trust is a virtue, but is trust, is trust the virtue that you put between these things? Because I think that the mean would be more of like a moderate type of skepticism.
Well, I would actually say that the mean would be something like consideration rather than trust, because trust actually would be a little bit closer towards gullibility, unless there's sufficient evidence presented. But something like consideration is you are looking at both the evidence presented and comparing it to knowledge, belief, etc. So that's not necessarily, the same thing as when I'm using the word skeptical, I'm referring to the Greek school of skepticism, which again, they'd walk right off cliffs because they weren't even sure if the cliff was real type stories.
Yeah, the philosophical skepticism,
Yes.
doubt everything. Yeah.
And so when you were using skepticism a moment ago, you were referring more towards the colloquial use of skepticism. But I'd say consideration is probably closer to like the colloquial skepticism than the philosophical one, which is what I was referring to as extreme.
Right. But the thing, the challenge that's presented in this is that, we'd say that that there have to be this type of like moderate skepticism in between skepticism and complete gullibility, is that there's no, when we take a look at something like a normative ethical system like virtue ethics, which people will present as a moral realist type system, is that there's they become prescriptive and descriptive kind of evaluations of actions and behaviors, and with and this has always been kind of like my problem with virtue ethics, is that, for something that's supposed to be prescriptive, is that I don't think that it really dives into, because it's so, case sensitive, is there how is it that we would prescribe what the right amount of skepticism is, or what the right amount of courage is?
Well, and that's where you get into the individual, this is where you get into the individual and the situation type thing. I think that this is where I'd also add the Stoics in, and this is where the application of reason and logic, I think, would frequently come in. The how-to is a function of both the individual and the situation. So, unfortunately, I don't think there's a universal answer, and that's what makes a lot of people uncomfortable about virtue ethics. When you talk about Stoicism, for example, they frequently talk about ridding oneself of the passions, but if you become a completely emotionless monster, which, of course, isn't what they're talking about per se, but it's how it's often interpreted, then we've also seen from... Oh, who's got the timer going off?
That's right. Your time is up. No, I'm just kidding. That's fine. That was actually my alarm going off to go walk my mother's dog, which I've already done.
So what you end up with at that point is, we've seen research, scientific research that shows that in the absence of emotion, one becomes paralyzed, can't make decisions. So obviously there's some level of the passions that are required in order to function, but the, not being ruled by them is the purpose of Stoicism. You see something very similar with the Nicomachean ethics model. You're talking about trying to find through reason, through your current knowledge, what the best middle ground is, and taking that as the virtuous action. So it's going to be how much virtue you're capable of practicing is, as he said, limited by your knowledge and your circumstance.
Yeah, I think that was one of the most fascinating things about researching the golden mean, is how it's like really personal. Like if you relate it to food, the virtuous thing would be to eat healthy and to eat the right amount of food, not to eat too much, not to eat too little. But for each individual person, that amount of food is going to be different. That mean is going to be different. But the action, the virtuous action, is always the same. At least that's, as a beginner looking at it, that's kind of one of the things I took away from the research.
Well, the action might be different, but the virtuous concept is always the same.
Yeah.
Well, so when we talk about
Before we get into the other part of the conversation, the tolerance part, I do have a final point just to relate to Christianity that I want to talk about on the golden mean. But go ahead, John. I'm sorry.
well, no, that's what I was going to do. I was going to lead into that. So if you have something to say before that, then please do.
Yeah, well, it just relates to vice and virtue in society, and why it's harder to be virtuous, and it's easier to have vice. And from what I was looking at, and I know Sokka and Ali are far more versed on this topic than I am, but like. If you ask a Christian, like, why is society full of vice and why does there seem to be so much less virtue, then they would say that it's Satan, it's the devil, it's all of these supernatural things, when in actuality, it's just simple math. I mean, if you look at the chart, there's one virtue to every two vices. So, I mean, just mathematics indicates that society is going to have more vice than virtue. And I just found that to be just a little fascinating thing that I'm thinking about. I'm going to think about on a deeper level.
Well, and the whole thing, like Sokka said at the beginning, that this topic came out of is he had asked that question to the panel in the stream that I had with Faye and Topic Thunder and Saf, and me and him had a lengthy discussion after that, where he was explaining the golden mean and all the components of it. And then when I did some further research ahead of tonight's stream, and I've been told already I was wrong when I brought it up before the stream, that there's actually more than one paradox of tolerance, and maybe Sokka and Ali can talk about that. But what I found was, okay, so when you talk about tolerance, as far as what I understand, so you have a virtue that is a spot in the middle of two extremes that is going to be different depending on as Ali said, situation and the person. And then you have on either side two vices. So when you talk about tolerance, to me, the way I understood it, and very well could be wrong, that the virtue is tolerance, and that the two vices would be on the side of excess would be tolerance of everything, and on the vice on the other end would be intolerance of everything.
But then the issue that you run in then is that so if you were to say that, well, intolerance of everything is a vice and tolerance of everything is a vice, but tolerance of some things is a virtue, it would also follow that intolerance of some things is a virtue as well.
Right.
Okay. So now that doesn't really become descriptive then of what one should be tolerant of, like or how one would practice tolerance.
Well, when you talk about the golden mean of courage, the vice on the deficient end is cowardice. I mean, so that's the same, root word and everything. I think it's all kind of semantical.
Well, I think, and just because I know people are asking about the paradox. So the paradox is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sokka, is if you tolerate intolerance, then those movements will spread and take over your society, right?
Yeah, essentially. Like, so there's a couple different ways to look at the paradox of intolerance, and this is like I just want to point out that this is a huge segue between virtue ethics. But what I'm looking for with this discussion is a solution to this, through virtue ethics. Like, does virtue ethics present a solution to this problem? So you have this the couple different problems that arise. Now the kind of like the main the paradox of tolerance that's gets presented was from Karl Popper, and it's this idea that in order to be tolerant of everything, okay, in order to allow for a state of being tolerant, allowing tolerance to be something that you like, is that you actually have to be intolerant of intolerance, intolerance of intolerant ideas. Is that and that's why it's a paradox. Is that you want to glorify the ability to be tolerant, and the only way that one can go about glorifying tolerance is to be intolerant of all ideas that are in fact intolerant. But if you're intolerant of all ideas that are intolerant, well, that would include the idea that you should be intolerant of intolerance.
So can I propose at least a slight semantic adjustment to the discussion just to make things a bit easier? And as far as so I would actually propose that when you're talking about tolerance as the virtue in the middle, you'd have indulgence on the excess and you'd have bigotry on the deficiency.
I'm sorry. Repeat that, Ali. I missed that. I was looking at the chat.
You would probably have like indulgence on the excess and bigotry on the deficiency if you talk about tolerance being the middle ground.
Well, I could see bigotry. I'm not sure about well, it's an interesting way of putting it. If you do it that way, so like, there's is all intolerance synonymous with bigotry?
Well, I mean, if you're using the very generic definition of bigotry that I've seen sort of lobbed at people who, have problems, say, with, like, when, say, somebody who is extremely racist and gets called out for it lobs bigotry at somebody who has called them out for being racist, it's generally used to mean a lack of ability to cope with ideas that are different from yours. So that would be the most extreme form of intolerance, would be bigotry, would it not? Like, in a very generic sense.
Right. And in that sense as well, is that can you be like bigoted towards bigotry?
Yeah, and I think that leads me, because that's the question I wanted to ask, and I just wanted to define the paradox quickly. Is I think that we really need to define what is tolerance. So is tolerance, not making like very bad ideas illegal to have? I think that that's a form of tolerance. Or is tolerance just letting them spew those ideas without any opposition? Is that tolerance? What is tolerance? What's the definition of that?
I think that you kind of described the problem there, is that, coming up with a solid definition of tolerance involves all these, conundrums and quandaries that Socka and Aliakai have been talking about. I mean, it's, I think that might be the problem, is how do we come up with a definition for what is tolerant?
So it's interesting because, like, if we try to take the paradox out of it, and that, when we talk about tolerance, then, and tolerance can't be just in relation to just intolerant ideas. So you don't run into this conundrum of, being bigoted towards bigotry or intolerant toward intolerance. Because this is the stuff that's going to arise from, these problems there, is that we can say that there's an innate sense of self-preservation that happens. So another kind of paradox that happens, within the paradox of tolerance, is that, people that become tolerant of intolerant ideas, to the fact that they're almost they appease it, or not really appease it, apathetic to it. They will define. It's the people that will say things like, well, I don't agree with what he says, but I agree
but I'll
with their
defend his right to say it.
Yeah, but I'll defend their right to say it. Well, the problem with that is that what happens when what this person is saying is that people that don't say the same thing as me, should be executed or put in jail. That a sense of self-preservation will pop up at this point in time and say, well, hold on a second. You're now gaining, a certain amount of security under the very thing that you want to abolish. And So they like that internal kind of self-preservation kicks up and says, well, I don't want to be tolerant to this idea.
Yeah, and I think that's the crux of it. Like, to use an example outside of the obvious one, which would be Nazis, right? The NIFB. So, I've always been of the opinion that people have a right to have these bad ideas, and I'm not sure if that's like, the paradox is, if you let the ideas go completely unchecked, then they kind of take over, right? And I think that you can almost see that in society. Like it seems like the far right in America right now has been given leeway to kind of just come out and take over, and it seems like it is expanding. There's repercussions. I mean, it's a quagmire of a political landscape here, but at the same time, it's the groups like the NIFB. They are spreading. They're getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we are actually posing what I would call a peaceful opposition. And that's always been my stance is, I'm for a peaceful opposition. I'm not for offensive violence. And I've kind of tested that talking about Antifa. Like, what do I really believe? And I think that this is the crux of this argument. And I'm still on the fence. I'm not sure if we should make it just outright illegal or not. Like, that does go against everything we have learned as Americans. So it's hard to overcome these childhood virtues, like we would consider freedom of speech to be a virtue. But when is it not a virtue? Fascinating discussion. I'm really glad that we're having this discussion.
Is, like in what you just said, kind of brings up the whole idea, the old, is it okay to yell fire in a crowded movie house? Yeah, people have the right to have bad ideas. They have the right to, freedom of speech. But then when you get like people like what you just talked about, like these NIFBs, out there on the pulpit, out there in the public sphere saying, and guys like Matt Powell saying it to you even one-on-one, well, yeah, the government should be, killing gay people, or you asked Matt Powell one time, well, it says in the Bible that unruly children, should be killed. Do you agree with that? And I think his response was, well, yep, if it's in the Bible, I'm all for that.
His exact response was absolutely.
Yeah, well, and so.
Well, this comes down to the, your right to swing your fist ends at the tip of my nose, so to speak. It's about the sort of power that ideas can have. And the rise of the alt-right is actually a very interesting sort of discussion for this because, first off, I want to say that I distinguish the alt-right from, plain Jane conservatives, which, will get me in trouble with my fellow lefties, but there is some, truth to it. Part of the reason that they've, ended up infiltrating a lot of the conservative spaces is that they tend to agree with a certain level of authoritarianism that that a lot of conservatives agree with. But like the alt-right sort of, I think, is a prime example of the disproving of the idea of the free marketplace of ideas, because the alt-right is brilliant in the way that they apply, without, I think, even realizing it, neuroscientific programming techniques, much like a cult would, to their followers. You get caught up in the alt-right pipeline on the YouTube algorithm, and through sheer repetition can slowly find your mind changed. Like, I had to actually pull my husband out of the alt-right pipeline. Like, that's how I ended up getting into YouTube, actually.
Wow.
Yeah, he started to fall down out of it, and then he started making like a bunch of almost pseudo-Nazi conspiracy theories and called me a racial slur. So that's sort of how I ended up meeting Pig Puncher, and eventually, through the chain of events that led up to Nokasuchi. My husband is about as liberal as you can get, or at least he was, but through sheer repetition and constant exposure to certain kinds of ideas from thinkers that he trusted in situations where he was, like when you're watching a YouTube video, your brain goes into a level of alpha state, just like when you're watching any other type of TV, you're slightly more suggestible. Like, this is a thing that has been studied.
I mean, there was a... I'm sorry. I was just going to say there was a very interesting video that I watched on YouTube the other day where a mother had noticed some things that her son was doing because he was being confronted with this, alt-right mindset and infiltrated with all these, dog whistles they use when he was gaming online. Apparently, the extreme right is now infiltrating these like gaming platforms and stream rooms and what have you, and using all the terminology and like you said with your husband, getting them used to this terminology, and it is almost like a programming, and she was looking at some things on his social media, and where is he getting this stuff? Like, and she had to explain to him, what that stuff was, and almost, as you said, like pull him out of that before his mind was completely polluted.
Yeah, and I think that's the danger, and that's like in terms of this discussion we're having tonight, it is a fucking paradox, and Socka was kind of talking about it before stream. Is like, even if you find a solution to this paradox, well, then you're hitting into another paradox, and there really is no easy answers when it comes to these extreme movements, so to speak. Like if you're trying to tolerate, extreme movements of hate or movements that are pretty much opposite of everything you stand for, it's really a really hard line. Like I said, I've always been for freedom of speech. Like I've always thought that you've had this innate freedom as an American to be stupid and have these stupid ideas. But as you get more into it, as you just every day I'm looking at the worst of the worst, it gets harder to hold that line of thinking, because you see them grow. You see Matt Powell get bigger and bigger and bigger, and Steven Anderson get bigger and bigger, and their movement is in other countries now. I think they're in 6 countries now. It is a scary thing. And then you understand that the statistics of America is 48% of the population of this country are fundamental Christians, fundamental, not moderate Christians, not progressive Christians, but fundamental biblical literalists. It's a very scary thought to have, and this is why so many people support Donald Trump, because he placates to them.
It's an interesting.
Socka, before you respond, I apologize. I know we're getting close to. How much more time do you have, Aaliyah Kai?
I had actually just talked to the Sticks and Stonehenge crew, and they said that I can start the stream a little bit late if I would prefer. Or we're kind of having that discussion at the moment. I'm thinking that I might be able to, because Callan was saying that she hasn't made the announcement yet as to when we're going to be doing it. So okay. I might be able to stick around for a bit. I need to get feedback back from everyone, because I just tagged the other contributors to figure out when everybody's going to be available. All
right, well, just let us know when you've nailed down when it is. But it'd be great if you could be here till 9:30. Go ahead.
I think that, yeah. So this is the reason why I find this such an interesting discussion, and like Naka brought up, like this inherently goes towards kind of like a political idea here, and I think that like we can lay out these examples where tolerance is not a virtue. And we could also lay out ideas where we would say that, intolerance is not a virtue, but also in some cases, you can also say that tolerance and intolerance can be virtuous. And this is the problem that I have, is trying to find that middle ground. What does that middle ground mean? And to give into that middle ground, where does this leave you now? So I think that like a lot of people will like we talked about, like Naka said this before, when we're looking at like people like the NIFB, is that like you have this gut instinct, that you want to be tolerant of them, you want to extend their freedom of speech, as long as they're not acting, we'll say, like they said again, like your freedom is your freedom is in your arms ends at the tip of my nose. So we want to grant them all this leeway, but we put this power on. So we try to take away from the power of just ideas themselves, and these ideas are, in a lot of cases, disgusting. And it's not just.
Quick interjection. I just got feedback from those of us that are going to be going to the Sticks and Stonehenge stream. They said that I'm fine to stick around until 9:30, and then we'll just start the stream within 15 minutes or so of that. So it looks like I'll be here till the end.
Awesome.
That's
great to hear.
Yep.
Yeah. So so you get to this position where you really start analyzing the tolerance of ideas themselves, and it would be so easy just to say that, listen, like these certain ideas, we are not conducive to a good society, like that like that self-preservation instinct kind of kicks in, which
itself is a form of consequentialism, right? What is the consequence of these ideas if enacted? That's where you start getting into normative versus meta ethics.
Well, the consequentialism is another branch of normative ethics, and when you between virtue ethics and consequentialism, I think that you could make an argument through consequentialism to say that looking at the consequence of allowing these ideas to prosper, would be detrimental to the overall happiness of the society or the functionality of the society, if you want to go down the utilitarian view of consequentialism.
If you wanted to stay entirely in the realm, sorry, I won't cut you off again, I promise. But
it's okay. As long as it's worth it, I'm okay with it.
It's difficult not to cut Socka off because at some point you got to get him to take a breath anyway. So.
We're not writing dissertations at the moment. This is supposed to be a discussion. I know they both start with dis, but anyway, sorry.
Ouch.
Oh, sorry. I've got a bit of dark humor. I pick on you if I like you. But anyhow, what I was trying to say was, I think this is where we start to get into, if you're talking purely from a virtue ethics standpoint, some decisions involve more than one virtue. And this is where, if you're talking about tolerance as a virtue, you'd have to then consider justice as being a secondary virtue. When making a decision regarding, say, a particular idea and allowing it to continue to exist or trying to quash it.
Yeah, can I just hop onto that for a second? And that's a great point, because there might be other things that we they might be derived from other virtues. They might be derived from values as well. That people hold towards something like gender equality is a huge one. Because you could take a look, like one of the things that like a lot of Abrahamic religions have in common is definitely like this kind of separation in the level of gender equality that's being presented there, and so because of this, like for example, like if something like gender equality is something to value, if you could take a look at that emphasis on equal treatment of everybody as a virtue, then yeah, that would maybe you don't even need to talk about tolerance and intolerance in the sense of that of vices or virtues or things to appeal for. You just appeal to the things that you actually value, or you appeal to the other virtues that you already have, instead of having to make even a discourse about tolerance.
So what you're saying is that maybe instead of tolerance, the issues that would fall under tolerance, we just need to categorize them differently and call them by other names, and then that would lead to a easier solution, basically.
Well, it might not even.
Hold on. I wanted to, before we got too far past it, something you'd said a few moments ago, Allie, made me think of this. Okay, so when you talk about virtues and how you had mentioned in the beginning that it's a personal thing, it's a situational thing, is there a difference then maybe between personal virtues as opposed to like societal virtues? Okay, because now, like for instance, societally we would say people have a right to to say what they want. Case in point, Nazis are able to have their parades, and the police will be there to protect them, to make sure that they're not harmed for their bad ideas. But most individuals would not be tolerant of that. But as a society, we tolerate that.
Well, and society has shifted, because honestly, our society used to not tolerate that. And it's a question that I wanted to bring up is, I'm a proud leftist. I don't run away from being hard left. I know many people are farther left than I am, but has the left pushed because the left was always, to me, the ones that stood against hatred and stand against hatred mostly. It's usually the left against the right. It's Antifa would be the extreme left, the Nazis would be the extreme right in this country. The dynamics of the politics of this country. So has the left pushed tolerance too far to where these bad ideas, at least when it comes to Nazism, and the right would say socialism, have we allowed tolerance to actually allow bad ideas in when before we didn't? And I'm not trying to answer the question myself. I'm just posing the question.
Right. And well, before and please, speak to his question, but to maybe make my question a little more succinct, because I'd really like to hear what your answer is to it, Ali, is that, is it two different discussions when you're talking about virtue ethics, as opposed to between individual virtue ethics and societal virtue ethics?
So, I mean, I guess the question is, are there societal universal ethics?
Oh God! So now we're back to the are there objective moral values or not? So the answer that Aristotle would probably give you, and the answer that he gives in Nicomachean Ethics, is that the ethic of the individual creates the society. Effectively, as Socka talked about when we were discussing earlier the definition of the golden mean, the idea that one is so virtuous that they reach eudaimonia, which we didn't really actually define, but it's effectively this state of, you can't really call it enlightened bliss, but it's peace, more like, if that makes sense. Like it's not necessarily like excessive joy or excessive suffering. It's that sort of peace in the middle. It's a state of equilibrium.
It's like living the best life that you can, basically.
Yeah, basically at any given time. So eudaimonia is actually possible for you in any given moment. It's not like a permanent state of being. You could be thrown out of it by, beginning to practice vice again or something along those lines. But the idea that Aristotle put forward was that if the vast majority of people are actively pursuing virtue, society itself will shift, which is very similar to the left's idea of if you stop tolerating negative ideas, they'll eventually disappear, or at the very least they'll be weakened. And so, like Socka, if you want to take it from here, you can. But that's Aristotle's answer.
Yeah, and real quick before Socka gets started, wasn't like Aristotle?
Set the clock.
Sorry, Socka, but you're going to be going for a while. Wasn't like his wasn't like his solution
30 minutes?
Like he wanted to have political movements that would instill ethical values into society. Wasn't that like Aristotle's solution?
He was very much his teacher's student in regards to Plato. He disliked the forms, and he spends the first part of Nicomachean Ethics heavily dogging on them. Like it is the most beautiful philosophical diss track. It's so much fun to read if you understand the things around it. But he actually did seem to align quite a bit with Republic, like Plato's Republic. This idea that philosopher kings would kind of be the most just rulers.
Yeah, all right.
So,
go ahead, Socka.
Hold on, John. Just to that point as well.
Because I never really got a straight answer to my question.
Well, I'm gonna give you a straight answer.
I gave you Aristotle's answer to your question, which is that the immorality of the individual shapes the society through mimicry.
Well, but let me.
Okay.
I shouldn't say I didn't get a straight answer. Maybe I didn't understand it, but.
Well, Alakai is completely right, and it's like if I could kind of just unpack what she's saying there is that when she started off, where she said this is where we're going to get into the topic of objectivity again, and it's right, because what that conversation does is it shifts it from the normative ethics that we're talking to back to the meta-ethical viewpoints here, because you're absolutely right, John. Is that what you're proposing could be an argument against the moral realist aspect of something like virtue ethics, and puts it more into the moral relativistic category, which is to say that if a culture values and sees virtue in certain behavior, that there's really nothing you can say about this, because this is this might be something that's unique not just to the individual but also to the culture themselves, which would make this a relativistic framework. So it wouldn't be objectively true for every single, culture or group out there. It's just something that would be very specific depending on, what culture it is that you've submerged yourself into. And this is actually one of the common challenges that people put forward against virtue ethics as a meta-ethical viewpoint rather than the normative one, though.
Well, right, and because the thing is like with what I always said, that's where I was confused, not because her explanation was flawed at all, just because of my ignorance on the subject matter, but it like when she talks about how like the individuals, if I heard right, something along the lines that if the individual's virtue ethics informs the greater group's ethical framework, then how do you end up with, because most people would find it deplorable Nazis marching in the streets, but as a society we tolerate that.
So, and here's where we get into the objective versus subjective reality problem. I'll come back to my point about virtue ethics sort of spreading in the society through mimicry briefly.
That's what it was I was trying to remember. Yep.
So effectively, this is a psychological research thing. And Socka, if you want to jump in and tell me that I'm wrong, this is my understanding of some psychological research that I've read. But it appears that our personalities and our ethical systems are sort of a composite of the people that we spend the most time with. So if you, for example, this is where I'm going to use a very slightly personal but very contentious example. There's been a lot of very inflammatory articles about how, quote, do your friends make you fat? Meaning that overweight people tend to gravitate towards overweight friends, and it has been found that if you become very, very close with an overweight person and spend a great deal of time with them, you yourself may begin to gain weight. And part of the reason for that is behavioral mimicry. Humans are very social animals. We have a segment of our brains that is specifically devoted to causing us near physical pain when we perceive social rejection. So humans will begin to mimic one another's behavior in order to even subconsciously to a certain extent, just in order to be able to feel like they fit in. This is one of the reasons why when people say become very successful, they will either end up with an entirely different social group or they will begin to hemorrhage their money towards their old shitty behaviors because the people around them are still stuck in the positions that they were in. It's very difficult to make lasting change if those around you are not doing the same thing or not at the very least supportive. So the idea of virtue ethics, to a certain degree, is that a society as a whole can be raised up through this medium by multiple people sort of adopting these things, and through mimicry it spreads, because that's kind of how we're constructed psychologically. However, this can have the backfire effect, as Socka pointed out. If you're in a society where, say, genocide is considered to be a virtue, as you've seen with the Hutu and the Tutsi, like I've been trying to avoid the problem of reductio ad Hitlerium because, like, let's face it, let's just not get there. We don't need to invoke Godwin's law 4 or 5 times during this stream, though racism is an interesting example.
No, I just was laughing at what you said. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, you said words I've never heard before.
That happens a lot with Allie and
I just want to say that, like, yeah, I have nothing to disagree with there. So
yeah, well, and I just would like to ask. So, and again, this is most likely 99% my idiocy. I'm still not seeing where, if and the phrase you used was that mimicry will say it again, like how individuals have their virtue ethics and through mimicry it propagates through the society. Is that kind of what you said, or?
Effectively, yes. If you have a group of individuals who are actively trying to practice virtue through mimicry, that can spread through the society.
All right, so, and sorry to interrupt, but so from what you just said there, I'm still not understanding how, and not to invoke Godwin's law again, how most people in society would mimic the idea that I don't like Nazis. Nazis are antithetical to to society, but then how do we go from there to, as a society, allowing them to spew their views in public and to march and all that if individuals don't abide by that?
I actually gave you an example of how that happened earlier. Things like the alt-right pipeline. Those ideas propagated through mimicry.
Okay.
And so to the point, like like if you take this like I said, if you go back to the meta ethical viewpoint. So remember, like at the beginning, we talked about the difference between the state of the normative state that we're talking about with virtue ethics, and the meta ethical viewpoint, which is like the origins of these things. So through something like virtue ethics. Sure. Mom's at work, buddy. I'm not noise. Okay. Sorry.
Give that kid his own mic and get him in here.
Sorry about that.
Oh, you're all right.
Yeah. So, if to the meta-ethical view, which is the origins of it. So, virtue ethics, you would ground it in some type of teleologic or teleonomical argument, where the state of eudaimonia that you're trying to reach would be something that's inherent to our nature, either by design or by just some type of teleonomical arguments in some way that. When people present, that would be the assertion of the meta-ethical viewpoint. When you bring up counter examples where that lead towards things like moral relativism, and you take away that objective basis of it, the standard reply, that people would offer against any type of a moral relativistic viewpoint is that just because a society does something, doesn't mean they're right. So what that means is that you hear this all the time, is that people will say something like, well, in every single culture, people think X is wrong, and
which is nearly impossible to prove for the vast majority of cultures.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't even be as simple as murder. Like, murder is, it's something that when you start talking about intent becomes quite messy.
Boy,
I used to have a lot of interactions with.
How you say murder?
Well, I used to have the interactions with Matt Smith, or not Matt Smith. Oh my goodness,
Matt Slick.
Matt Slick, thank you. And he, anybody that's ever watched Matt Slick, he always brings up this example. I'm not going to repeat it here because it's an absolutely kind of atrocious example, but he would put forward this example as something that all cultures would view as immoral. And then he would say, well, if every single person thinks that this is moral, that this is universal, that this is an objective moral fact. But the fact that everybody agrees on a certain point doesn't make something an objective moral fact.
That's an ad populum fallacy.
Right. And in the same sense that if somebody was to say, well, I think that it's an objectively moral fact that murder is wrong. And the people will point to cultures that say, well, this culture, did this. And they'll try to use that as an example of moral relativism to argue against the objective moral facts. But the simple answer would be that, well, even if you have a relativistic society that functions with murder as being something that they do, that doesn't mean that they're right. If objective moral facts did exist, that culture would just be thought of as wrong. They're incorrect in their moral assessments of that situation. And it's the same way that when you present the challenge from eudaimonia, is that where you say that, well, you can take a look at people like different cultures that would aspire to have that have different values and would highlight different virtues because of this, and that this somehow supports moral relativism. Well, it doesn't, because it's actually entirely possible that these cultures are actually just wrong. But in order to argue for that, this is where you're going to have to push the argument back from the normative ethical viewpoint of this and start arguing meta-ethics.
Well, and this is also, if you're starting to talk about the basis of things like eudaimonia it's a particular state of being. I know that it's something that Aristotle claims is inherent to human nature, but honestly, I think it's more of an evolutionary prerogative. The human brain does its damnedest to shortcut in any way it possibly can. So eudaimonia is a sort of state of stasis. That's one of the reasons why I described it as being a state of peace. I think that if you start talking about things that are quote unquote universal, you'd have to start talking about what is most useful for the most number of cultures possible in order to continue to perpetuate the human species without reducing our population to a point where we can no longer achieve enough genetic diversity to continue. And that's probably the broadest possible brush that you could paint with, and it would offend quite a few modern but it is ultimately the closest thing that we can find to anything objective in terms of talking about things without resulting to divine command theory.
Yeah, and the issue with something like that too is that you start moving it away from just the virtues themselves, and now you're moving into a position of utilitarianism, which will, when you start talking about utility, and that moves you out of the virtue ethics realm of normative ethics and into consequentialist.
Well, I think, though, that there's a certain, when you talk about Nicomachean ethics specifically, Aristotle actually acknowledges this. He talks about the reason why the golden mean is so applicable is because it tends to minimize the negative consequences from either vice. So it is sort of derived from consequentialism to a certain extent. It's just when you talk about it in a very ethical sense.
Mm-hmm. And also, it also has to do with the structure of the argument coming from, like I said, you're not starting with the consequence itself. You're starting with met the people, more ground roots, bottom up, like I've said before.
But one would argue, though, that one's knowledge that would lead to determining what your two excesses would be, your excess or your deficiency, would itself be derived from consequences that you faced in the past. So at that point, you've kind of got this reciprocal loop where, as Aristotle said, most vice behavior results from a lack of knowledge or a lack of proper knowledge, meaning that you may be mistaken in the way that you understand something. So if in that regard, your experience with consequences to past actions ultimately informs what you determine is virtuous at any given time.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So, in other words, virtue ethics are completely inseparable from consequentialism. It's just they're not often spoken of that way because most people don't really delve deep enough into that side of things to sort of consider the implications.
So
I might have, I might have some problems with saying that it's inseparable from consequentialism. I think that there's a certain appeal to the consequence that does happen. I think what would be more apt to say would just describe, like I said, the structure of it, rather than starting off purely on the nature of what the consequences of an action are, and starting more along the lines of the virtues that are being employed by the people. And from there, like, yes, of course, the learning experience, when you're approaching these things, could be derived from the consequence of actions. But deriving, lessons from learned experience is probably, we could call this, learning from consequence. And just as a philosophy, I think is better with is different from consequentialism. Shouldn't be conflated in that way.
No, I guess that's a fair point. What I was trying to say was that there's a certain connection between the two of them that I think is often ignored in these discussions. I suppose that's what I was trying to say.
I'll tell you, what I find fascinating about all this is like everything that you folks have talked about, Socka, Ali, Doc. I mean, everybody does these things, goes through these thought processes of what is virtuous, what is a vice, and makes their individual decisions every day without really knowing the intricacies and the nuts and bolts of it, like you folks have been talking about tonight. I've
said this to Nock once before. Everybody is doing philosophy all the time. It's just whether or not you're doing it well or badly, which is to say, are you doing it consciously?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it goes back to like last week when we discussed like abductive reasoning. Like, it's just such a vital part of aspect of our ability to reason that we employ all the time. And when you describe it, it almost seems just like, well, yeah, of course we should do this. But sometimes it's really hard to kind of articulate what the concepts are, and that's actually fascinating about the human mind. Is that we actually have the ability to have that introspective look and to actually be able to evaluate our reason. We can reason about reasoning, which is something that is unique to humans.
Well, and when with what Ali, how she capsulized what I was trying to say, without brevity, she put it in such a much better phrasing than I did. And with what she said reminded me, I hate to invoke this person's name. So when people like Messenger, who tries to eschew philosophy and say it has no bearing on, these different other aspects of life and other, other, schools of thought or, other aspects of just anything in life. I mean, he just basically wants to throw philosophy out the window that has no value at all.
I find
It's just so much nonsense.
I find that extremely funny, considering that psychology as a field, at least in part, derives from philosophy. So does most of science, to be honest. Like, physicae is the Greek branch of philosophy that dealt with natural processes. It was the precursor to the scientific method. But even psychology itself, CBT as a therapy, which is used, it's something that Messenger pushes quite hard as something that you can do by yourself, which to a certain degree you can, but it really works best when you're working with a professional. CBT derives entirely from Stoicism. You can't even, separate the field he claims to be a part of from philosophy.
Well, and just in case he's watching now or in the future, still love you, Messenger, but don't agree with you on that and a lot of other things. And for anybody that just to clarify for people out there, CBT, when Aaliyah Kai speaks of that, she's talking of cognitive behavioral therapy. So where are we at in this discussion, folks? I throw that to all of you. Where do you think we're at? What other turns or rabbit holes we might take?
I want to present a problem to Nokasuchi and anybody else that wants to answer here, just along the political viewpoint on this one, is that if you value, I'm not going to call it a virtue, it's just called value, but if you value tolerance, okay, and that you want to try to get to as inclusive as possible, you're left with these problems where you would have to be tolerant of people like the NIFB, which is, I know, is something that most people probably wouldn't want to do, is that these ideas are bad. These ideas should be stopped. We shouldn't allow them to spread. But how would you go about this? How would you go about trying to stop the spread of intolerance? Without first off either becoming intolerant yourself or authoritarians.
Well, all right. So for me, like I said, this is something I've actually been struggling with for the last few months. I think I might be actually going farther left on this issue than I was before, but farther left in my own way. I did pose a question because I do think that I think the definition of tolerance is what really needs to be addressed mainly. But so when it comes to like these groups, and so when I think of inclusive, I think, the possibility of everybody having their culture and their core beliefs intact and segregated together. But when you're talking about fringe beliefs, and especially when it's fringe beliefs that history has shown leads to very bad things, to say the least.
You might not even want to define it as fringe beliefs. Like, one of the most, I think, useful definitions for talking about the sorts of beliefs that a lot of the people in the left want, left by the wayside, so to speak, or at the very least socially punished, if not legally punished, would be beliefs that ultimately advocate for violence against a particular group.
Yeah.
Because those opinions are not simply opinions. If you'd say if your opinion would lead to that sort of severe harm.
Yeah, it's this is the tricky question of this conversation, and it's really made me consider my politics a little bit, because I don't know the answer. I don't know what the correct solution. So my solution has always been to try to have a louder voice than they do, and my platform is growing, so I can't really be loud in the way like Mr. Atheist can be loud or somebody along those lines. But what I can do is be, like, physically loud. I can be the loudest voice in the room. I could stand in just unabated opposition of hateful ideas, and that would be. We've got
Maynard Sades with the smoke weed every day.
Yeah, smoke weed every day.
Oh, I clicked the wrong one.
But so I'm not sure where I stand on this, because I've always been tolerant to ideas. Like me and Ali spoken about this. I'm not sure if we spoke about it on a stream or if it was after a stream, but
it may have been one of our many long philosophical discussions.
I was raised in North Carolina, and I was basically like, before Antifa was really become a thing, when I first came out of my racism, standing in opposition to Klan rallies and marches and Nazi marches down in North Carolina. And I've hit some Nazis. I've punched some Nazis. Back then, it was socially accepted that that's what you did. It wasn't a thing Antifa did. It was a thing that Americans did. So I'm not sure, honestly, what is, like, if you're talking about fascism and dictatorship coming to America, what's the American solution? Is it to accept that? Is it if Trump is showing authoritarian leanings, if he's showing like a complete disregard for the Constitution, seeking re-election, should we give a dictator power? I'm not sure what the answers to. I mean, these are very tough questions, and one of the most fascinating things about this discussion, even though we didn't really take it to the political side, we've spoken of these things, but ultimately, I don't fucking know what the answer is. This is the paradox, I think.
I think your answer is spot on about just, metaphorically having a louder voice, answering back to the bad ideas. And just real quick, shout out to Maynard Saves there. Thanks for that super chat. And hello, Barney Tearspell. I DM'd you and invited you to this discussion and never heard back from you. So I don't know. I DM'd you on Discord.
What's on the other side of the world time, John. Right.
Well, and I know sometimes he isn't always on Discord and see those DMs, but it would have been nice to have you here, Barney. So we're at about 9:22 here, 9:23 now. I know Aliakai has a stream coming up. And also we may want to at the when we end the broadcast, if you have just like 2 minutes, Aliakai, before you take off, and Socka, however much time you have, Nock wants to put some short little thing together that maybe the Patreons in the house could look for in the future. So be looking for that if we're able to put that together. But
if I can get my studies right, it's just like a couple questions for each of you, just for patrons. It's something that I tried to do before, and I had my settings all fucked up. So I just got to make sure my settings are good.
Yep. And so I think we can, wind this down and, go around the room, get final thoughts, and, anything you want to let people know. And we'll start with Aliakai, because I got to say, I think that in the future, we need to get Ali off that mod thing and in as a participant more often. So Aliakai, so your final thoughts, Ali, and anything else you want people to know?
So my final thoughts on the subject, as far as the paradox of tolerance and virtue ethics in general, I think that part of the difficulty with having these discussions is when you try to distill these ideas down to simply one virtue or, as Socka put it earlier, one value. You're considering multiple angles when you're trying to consider these things. And that's where my Stoic side says, well, this is where the application of reason and knowledge comes in. This is where figuring out, to the best of your knowledge, between the various values that you have, the various virtues that you are dealing with, what the best sort of the best course of action could potentially be. And again, that is both an individual thing, but it is also a societal thing, and it's a thing that is constantly being renegotiated because of mimicry, because of the way that, ideas themselves seem to spread and evolve very similarly to the way that genes do. Like there's a lot of different, theories around this. I'm sure there's a name for it, but it's getting late enough that I can't recall it. So, I think that oversimplifying the condition, should we be tolerant or not? Is this violating, this particular value or not, this one specific thing? I think that that's where we get into trouble. I think that you have to consider significantly more, considerations for that. I think that finding the middle ground can be quite the struggle for some. And I think that it's because of that reduction that we are dealing with. As far as announcements, sometime in the next 15, 20 minutes, maybe a half an hour, it depends on how long it takes me to get my shit together with YouTube because OBS doesn't like it very much. Sticks and Stonehenge is going to be doing that stream on the Kurds. It's going to be Kingetto, Callan, and myself. And if we have another pagan or even an atheist who'd like to come on to talk about it, we would love to have you. So shoot me a Callan and DM if you're interested.
Awesome. And before we go on to Socka Count, I invited Barney Tearspell, so I'm going to let him have his say since he wasn't able to make it. He says tolerance does not mean acceptance nor agreement. Tolerance does not mean that there are no punishable acts, but punishment should be done with compassion and respecting the veil of ignorance. And one thing I like about that comment is I think Barney has given me an idea for a future stream here on Nokasuchi's. We can talk about the veil of ignorance and all the issues surrounding that. Socka Count, your final thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that's first thing is that like I always say, like I'm approaching this from like I'm not an academic in this. This is just topics that I find absolutely fascinating, and it's good to relate them to things like I said, like for myself, discussions with many theists I do have when it comes to the question of ethics. So it's good to kind of people find this stuff fascinating, or they want to just learn a little more about this stuff. Going in and talking about normative versus descriptive ethics and meta ethics and applied ethics. Like these are all really great terms that realize that a lot of these conversations are kind of oversimplified when it comes to discussing these things. And it's a deep dive sometimes, but it's really fascinating because people I don't believe they pick their ethical viewpoints like like the favorite sports team. It's just that you read something and it just resonates with you. And on top of that, I just want to thank Alikai for being here as well. Very informative. I really appreciated you joining us in this, and thank Nokasuchi and John for hosting this and participating as well. Because some amazing questions that really drove this conversation forward. That's amazing.
You can call me Ali, by the way, if you have a hard time. It's Aliakai.
Yeah, Aliakai. I was going to correct him myself.
Thank you.
Aliakai.
Do it too. Yeah, Ali's so much easier.
So Nokasuchi, your final thoughts?
Yeah, this was a fascinating discussion, and I can see like just so many discussions in the future. Like I think we could have a whole stream on Sokka's last question, and I think I kind of try to pose the question before that with my question is, does the left really push maybe a toxic form of tolerance? I can see a lot of streams stemming from this, and just.
To be honest, that'd be a great thing to talk to Pig Puncher about. To be honest, if we can get him on here.
And I enjoy these philosophical questions. Yeah, like that exchange when Ali and Sokka was just going back and forth, and me and John were just. You can't see John, but I'm pretty sure my face was like, "What the fuck are we hearing right now?" Because it was just brilliant. Like it was real deep, and I learned a lot. And that's what I love from these group conversations is when I can learn. I know people like the dumpster fires. I miss the dumpster fires. I'm working on getting one back for you guys. That should be a shit show. But these are the conversations I enjoy the most, especially considering, this week my edited content will be finishing up with 8 Shrooms Found Jesus. If you guys haven't watched that video, it's not getting the views that my Christian responses usually get. It's going to be totally worth it. It's hilarious. But next week, I'm actually turning my attention back to the alt-right, and I'm going to be doing videos on the alt-right. And I think that this is a very good leeway into the edited content that I'm going to have next week. So I want to thank both of you. I want to thank John for having such great conversations when he does the show on this channel. It's his show. He runs it. He does everything. If I show up, I'm just a guest. He gets the guests. He comes up with the topics. And just week after week, it's been just a good show, John. So kudos to you, man. thank you. And yeah, that's it for me. If you haven't been watching Utah Outcast this week, I'm on it, so go check it out.
Well, just a couple of things, and then I'll close out too. We'll close the stream out. Like, Ikai mentioned Pig Puncher, and I'm just wondering what would happen if we had a stream with both Pig Puncher and Math Pig. Would Math Pig have to be in fear of his life with Pig Puncher in the room since he punches pigs?
Only in Minecraft.
Yeah, and to touch on something Nokasuchi said, yes, having these two folks, Socka and Aliakai, in here, and Nokasuchi too. He brought up some points that I wasn't aware of when I researched this topic. But the tongue in cheek, my streams are called John Learns New Shit, and so I would have to say that tonight I learned a few things, but the most important thing I learned was I have a lot more reading and research to do. So that's the best part about this, is that I learn a few things when we have these discussions, and then I see where I got to go search out some more information. So that's always a good thing, to recognize your ignorance and then go about doing something about it. And I just want to say real quick, I try and see everybody that's here. Thanks, AR, for coming by. Barney, it was great that you were able to show up. Tony Designs, we love you, man. Maynard Saves, you're my other brother from another mother. Stupid Horror Energy, she's here all the time. We love you. Richard Mattson in the house. Fuck Jesus Lord, by the way, Richard Mattson. And to anybody I missed, thank you so much for coming by. Next Wednesday, I'll be on a GDC, and I'll be on Nokasuchi's channel next Saturday. My channel, The Amateur Conversationalist, probably not doing anything Sunday. I have something scheduled, but I'm not sure if that guest is going to make it. And I'm kind of busy putting together my new podcast that starts next month, the Apostate Alliance. We're going to be talking to ex-Muslims and apostates of other religions. Nokasuchi has agreed to take part in some of those and be a guest host. And as well, Faye the Most Gracious is going to co-host some of those with me as well. Thanks to everybody for coming by. And just remember, be the conversation.